For 40 years, he hid in plain sight as a grandfather watering his lawn. Tonight, you'll learn how a single discarded tissue cracked America's most elusive serial case. And the genealogy trick investigators used? It was technically illegal at minute 11. On the night of June 18, 1976, in the quiet Sacramento suburb of Rancho Cordova, a 23-year-old woman woke to a flashlight burning directly into her eyes. A masked man stood at the foot of her bed, his breathing slow, deliberate, controlled. He whispered a threat through clenched teeth, bound her wrists with shoelaces he had brought with him, and disappeared into the night with a handful of small, almost worthless trinkets. She survived. She would be one of the lucky ones. Because over the next 12 years, that same man would terrorize the state of California, from the suburbs of Sacramento to the coastal towns of Santa Barbara and Orange County. He would commit at least 13 murders, more than 50 rapes, and over 120 home invasions. Investigators would give him many names: the East Area Rapist, the original Night Stalker, the Visalia Ransacker, the Diamond Knot Killer. It would take more than 4 decades, the invention of an entirely new branch of forensic science, and a public DNA database designed for hobbyists to finally give him his true name. Joseph James DeAngelo, a former police officer, a grandfather, a man who had been hiding in plain sight, just miles from his earliest crime scenes for the entirety of those 44 years. This is the story of how the Golden State Killer was caught, and why the methods used to catch him changed criminal investigation forever. To understand the man, you must first understand the geography of his terror. It began, investigators now believe, in the small agricultural town of Visalia, California, in 1973. A prowler began breaking into homes in the dead of night. He did not steal jewelry or electronics. He stole single earrings, photographs, family mementos, and women's underwear. He arranged objects on the floor in strange patterns. He left lights on. He shuffled framed pictures. He seemed to want the homeowners to know he had been there. Locals called him the Visalia Ransacker, and over the course of 2 years, he was tied to more than 100 burglaries. Then, in September of 1975, a journalism professor named Claude Snelling heard a noise in his home and rushed outside to find a masked man trying to abduct his teenage daughter from her bed. Snelling confronted him. The intruder shot him twice and fled into the darkness. Claude Snelling died on his own driveway. 6 weeks later, a Visalia detective spotted the same masked figure in a neighborhood and chased him on foot. The suspect turned, fired a shot that struck the detective's flashlight, and vanished. After that night, the Visalia Ransacker was never seen in Visalia again. But 200 miles north in Sacramento, something far worse was about to begin. In June of 1976, the East Area Rapist made his debut. His method was meticulous, almost military in its precision. He stalked his victims for weeks before striking. He cut phone lines. He unlocked windows during daytime reconnaissance visits. He sometimes called the homes of his future victims, breathing into the phone, hanging up. When he attacked, he wore a ski mask and gloves. He carried a duffel bag containing pre-cut lengths of cord, knives, and ligatures tied in an unusual diamond knot, a fishing knot that suggested specialized training. He would enter the bedroom, shine a flashlight in his victim's eyes, and force the woman to tie up the man of the house. Then he would stack dishes or coins on the husband's back, telling him that if he heard a single sound, he would kill everyone. He would take the woman to another room. He would assault her for hours. He would eat food from the refrigerator. He would weep openly between attacks, sometimes mumbling about a girl named Bonnie, sometimes saying he hated his mother. He would stay in the home for as long as 4 hours, and then he would simply vanish into the suburbs. Between 1976 and 1979, he attacked at least 50 women in Sacramento and the surrounding counties. Sacramento County deployed massive resources. They organized neighborhood watch programs. They held town hall meetings. At one such meeting, in 1977, a man in the audience stood up and reportedly mocked a husband who claimed he had been unable to protect his wife. Quote, he said, "I would never let a man do that in my house." 2 weeks later, the man who had stood and mocked was murdered alongside his wife in their home. The killer had been in the room that night, listening. He had taken the criticism personally. In 1979, the attacks in Northern California abruptly stopped. Investigators feared he had been arrested for some other crime, killed, or institutionalized. They were wrong. He had moved south. In October of 1979, in Goleta, near Santa Barbara, a couple was attacked in their bed by a masked intruder who tied them up using the exact same diamond knot. They escaped by running into the street. He fled on a stolen bicycle. 2 months later, in the same neighborhood, Dr. Robert Offerman and his girlfriend, Dr. Deborah Manning, were shot to death in their home. The killer had eaten leftover Christmas turkey in the kitchen before leaving. Over the next 7 years, he would murder couples in their beds across Ventura County, Orange County, and Santa Barbara County. He bludgeoned them. He shot them. He bound them with the diamond knot. He posed their bodies. By May of 1986, when he raped and killed 18-year-old Janelle Cruz in her Irvine home, he had taken at least 13 lives. And then, just as suddenly as he had appeared, he was gone. For more than 20 years, the case went cold. The killer's signature, those diamond knots, those whispered threats, those food binges in the kitchen, became the stuff of cold case legend. Detectives retired. Survivors raised families. The killer's letters, the taunting maps he had drawn, the recordings of his phone calls to surviving victims, sat in evidence boxes in 3 separate jurisdictions. Nobody had connected the Visalia ransacker to the East Area rapist. Nobody had connected the East Area rapist to the original Night Stalker. The cases sprawled across hundreds of miles and multiple police departments that, in the era before computerized databases, rarely talked to each other. The first major breakthrough came in 2001. A forensic technician in Orange County named Mary Hong was running DNA comparisons between unsolved Southern California murders when she got a match. The semen recovered from the 1980 murders of Lyman and Charlene Smith in Ventura was a genetic match to the semen recovered from the 1981 murders of Cherry Domingo and Gregory Sanchez in Goleta. The Southern California killings were the work of a single man. Months later, a Contra Costa County criminalist named Paul Holes, an investigator who would become legendary in this case, pushed for further testing. He compared the Southern California DNA to evidence from the East Area rapist case in Sacramento. The samples matched. One man, one DNA profile, more than 100 crimes. The East Area rapist and the original Night Stalker were the same man. Crime author Michelle McNamara would later coin the name that finally united every case under a single banner, the Golden State Killer. But a DNA profile is useless without a name to match it to. For 17 more years, that profile sat in the FBI's CODIS database, waiting. Investigators checked it against every new felony arrest in America. They checked it against military DNA samples. They checked it against international databases. Nothing. The killer had either never been arrested for a qualifying felony, or he had been very, very careful. Michelle McNamara, the journalist who had become consumed by the case, died in her sleep in April of 2016 before her book, I'll Be Gone in the Dark, was published. She had spent years building her own database, interviewing survivors, walking crime scenes at night with a flashlight, calling Paul Holes at 3 a.m. with new theories. She would never see what happened next. In early 2018, Paul Holes and a small team of investigators, including FBI agent Steve Kramer, made a radical decision. The CODIS database was a closed system. It only contained DNA from convicted felons. But there was another kind of database, growing every day, that contained DNA from millions of ordinary Americans. Genealogy websites. Sites like Ancestry, 23andMe, and a smaller open-source platform called EdMatch, where users uploaded their genetic data to find distant cousins and build family trees. What if, the team wondered, they uploaded the killer's DNA profile to one of these sites? They would not be looking for the killer himself. They would be looking for his relatives. The technique was called investigative genetic genealogy, and in early 2018 it had never been used to solve a major American crime. They worked with a genealogist named Barbara Ray Venter. They reformatted the killer's old crime scene DNA into a file that mimicked a consumer genetic test. They uploaded it to GEdmatch under a fake profile, and they waited. The hits came back almost immediately. Distant cousins, third cousins, fourth cousins. people who shared on average one great-great-grandparent with the killer. From those distant cousins, Ravenner and her team began building family trees backward in time, identifying common ancestors born in the 1800s. Then they built forward, tracing descendants down through generations to the present day, looking for a man who would have been the right age, the right size, and in the right places at the right times. It took 4 months. They narrowed the field from 25 family trees to a single branch. From that branch, they identified a single suspect, a 72-year-old former police officer living in Citrus Heights, a Sacramento suburb just a few miles from the heart of the original East Area rapist attacks. His name was Joseph James DeAngelo. He had served in the Navy during the Vietnam War. He had been a police officer in Exeter, California, near Visalia, from 1973 to 1976, exactly when and where the Visalia ransacker had operated. He had then transferred to the Auburn Police Department, just outside Sacramento, from 1976 to 1979, exactly when and where the East Area rapist had attacked. He had been fired from Auburn in 1979 for shoplifting a hammer and a can of dog repellent from a drugstore. The timing of his firing aligned with the killer's sudden move to Southern California. He had been hiding behind a badge. But a family tree match is not proof. Investigators needed a direct DNA sample from DeAngelo himself, and they needed it without alerting him. So they began surveillance. For days, they watched the small ranch house on Canyon Oak Drive. They watched the 72-year-old grandfather mow his lawn, ride his motorcycle, shop for groceries. And then one afternoon, DeAngelo opened the door of his car at a Hobby Lobby parking lot. He gripped the door handle. He closed the door. Detectives swarmed the car after he walked away, swabbing the handle for skin cells. Days later, they retrieved a tissue from the trash can outside his home. Both samples were rushed to the lab. Both samples matched the Golden State Killer profile perfectly. The probability of a random match was less than 1 in a septillion. On April 24, 2018, a SWAT team surrounded DeAngelo's home. He was outside in his garage when they took him into custody. He did not resist. He did not run. He went limp. According to investigators, his first words in the interrogation room, spoken quietly to himself, were chilling. "I did all that," he reportedly said. There was an inner personality. He called it, by some accounts, Jerry. He blamed Jerry, as if the man who had stalked, raped, and murdered for over a decade had been a separate entity living inside the body of a retired truck mechanic and grandfather of 3. The case against DeAngelo was overwhelming. In June of 2020, to avoid the death penalty, he pleaded guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder and admitted to dozens of additional rapes and kidnappings that could no longer be prosecuted because the statute of limitations had expired. At his sentencing, in a courtroom converted from a college ballroom because of the COVID-19 pandemic, survivors spoke to him for hours. They described what he had stolen from them. They described decades of nightmares, ruined marriages, panic attacks, fear of the dark, fear of windows, fear of phones ringing in the night. DeAngelo sat in a wheelchair, his head bowed, sometimes appearing to doze. When given the chance to speak, he stood, removed his face mask, and said only this: "I've listened to all your statements, each one of them, and I'm truly sorry to everyone I've hurt." He was sentenced to 11 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. He will die in prison. The arrest of Joseph DeAngelo did more than close one of the largest unsolved case files in American history. It opened an entirely new chapter in forensic science. In the months and years that followed, investigative genetic genealogy was used to identify suspects in dozens, then hundreds, then thousands of cold cases. The Bear Brook murders, the Buckskin Girl, the killer of Crystal Beslanowicz, cases that had been dead for 30, 40, 50 years suddenly cracked open within weeks. But the technique also raised urgent ethical questions. The vast majority of people in genealogy databases had never consented to having their DNA used in criminal investigations. By uploading a sample to find their grandparents, they had unknowingly handed over the genetic signatures of every cousin, every nephew, every distant relative they had ever had. GEDmatch eventually changed its policy, requiring users to opt in to law enforcement searches. Other sites, like Ancestry and 23andMe, refused to cooperate entirely. Lawmakers in several states began drafting legislation to regulate the practice. The debate continues today. And then there is the haunting question that no DNA test can answer. How did a police officer, a man trained to protect the public, become one of the most prolific serial offenders in American history? Former colleagues remembered D'Angelo as quiet, controlling, prone to fits of rage. Neighbors described screaming matches with his wife, profanity-laced tirades over property lines, a quick and explosive temper. His former fiancée, a woman named Bonnie Colwell, broke off their engagement in the early 1970s after he had begun displaying violent and possessive behavior. Detectives now believe that some of the East Area rapists' whispered threats, references to a girl named Bonnie, were aimed at her. He may have spent a decade reenacting his rage against a single woman who had escaped him. Or perhaps the truth is simpler and darker. Perhaps Joseph D'Angelo was, as he himself suggested in that interrogation room, two people. The grandfather who watered his lawn, and the man in the ski mask who whispered through clenched teeth, the patrolman who wore the badge during the day, and the predator who used his police training to evade his own colleagues at night. The man who pleaded guilty in a wheelchair, and the inner voice he called Jerry, the one he claimed had done all that. We will never fully know. He has stopped talking. He sits, today, in a maximum security medical prison in California, where he is expected to live out the remainder of his days in silence. The victims he murdered cannot speak. The survivors he tormented have said all they have to say. The only voice that ever truly mattered, the voice of the man behind the mask, has chosen at the end to whisper only an apology and then say nothing more. What remains is the science. A drop of saliva on a hand-built rape kit from 1978, a skin cell on a car door handle in 2018, a family tree built from strangers in Idaho and Oregon and the deep American South, none of whom had ever heard the name Joseph D'Angelo. 4 decades of silence, broken by a string of code no longer than a paragraph. The Golden State Killer believed he had won. He had survived the 80s, the 90s, the 2000s. He had outlived the detectives who hunted him. He had outlived Michelle McNamara, the journalist who had named him. He had, by any reasonable measure, gotten away with it. And then a great-great-grandparent he had never met, dead more than a century before his first crime, reached forward through time and turned him in. If this story gripped you, subscribe to Dark Cases for more deep dives into the world's most chilling unsolved crimes. Hit the bell so you never miss the moment a cold case finally breaks. And tell us in the comments which forgotten case you want us to investigate next.